Ordinary Nigerians.
The story you're about to hear is true. Any speculations will be stated as such. Music, dance, glamour. These are the lifeblood of Yoruba celebrations, and they are most vividly displayed during one of their most significant cultural events: weddings. In the early parts of 1911, Dr. Oguntola Sapara likely daydreamed about an elaborate ceremony for his coming wedding to his lover, Sarah Olaore Green. He met her during his pioneering efforts as a medical doctor in the Lagos colony and reportedly encouraged her to pursue a career in midwifery. In colonial Lagos, with a very low literacy rate, a Christian, British-educated woman like her was the perfect match for a man of his caliber. At the time, Dr. Sapara was among the earliest practicing indigenous medical doctors in the colony, and he already cast a legendary shadow on the practice. A man of his stature was expected to find a woman who matched him in intellect, social standing, and economic prospects. So it was no surprise that they met, fell in love, and decided to get married in church, following British tradition and colonial standards. Typically, as part of church weddings, the officiating minister would ask if anyone had reason to oppose the union, and usually silence would follow. But on this occasion, a woman spoke out of turn. She objected to the union long before the ceremony began, before the wedding bells could be rung, while the planning was still in its earlier stages. It was a woman who knew Sapara and bore a grudge against him. She believed that by marrying Olaore Green, he had breached the same Christian custom he intended to marry into, and had violated a legal edict from the Marriage Ordinance of 1884. To the court, she pointed out that he was already married and was therefore breaking the law by attempting to marry someone else. She was right, and she knew it because she was his wife. Her name was Madame Adele Sapara.
And welcome once again to Your Question
All four
and
participants in today's
Now the
discussion
first
are high
question
school
today
students
will
from
come to the
Africa.
handicapped
Let me
from
introduce them to
who
you
asked,
now.
good afternoon, who asked that the professional
18-year-old
and
Alpha
that
Dan.
This is the Ordinary Nigerians podcast, your window into the lives of the remarkable yet everyday Nigerians in history. Hear their stories, feel their experiences, and connect with the voices that helped shape our world. Lagos in 1911 was the sort of place where native institutions had begun to give way to colonial conventions. The nature of healthcare had changed with the introduction of native Western-trained medical doctors into the colonial system. Even slavery, long accepted in many areas, was actively being challenged by local reformers who demanded its final extinction. Few aspects of Yoruba life bore the imprint of this change as deeply as the institution of marriage. Native marriage, which the British met on ground, had been fluid and familial, accommodating polygamous unions as long as both families gave their consent. But under the colonial order, marriage was evolving to become something else entirely, a more rigid legal contract enforcing monogamy by law under the watchful supervision of the church. As historian Christine Mann has noted, the British considered Western marriages as central to Christianity and thus demanded monogamy as a condition for baptism. The differences between native and Christian marriages ran deeper than the question of monogamy. They represented two entirely different ways of understanding kinship, duty, and the very purpose of marriage itself. In Yoruba society, marriage was first and foremost a family affair. Courtship almost exclusively began with families initiating contact, fact-finding, and negotiating terms. The couple themselves were less prominent during the discussions. N.A. Fadipe, who studied southwestern Nigeria in the 1930s, instructively stated that the Yoruba did not attach much significance to the sentiments existing between the couple before marriage. Consequently, Yoruba women did not simply join their husbands after marriage. They became a part of their families in form and spirit. Their place in their new households came with defined responsibilities and expectations, and they often became part of a wider web of kinship obligations that stretched beyond their husbands. Christian marriages, by contrast, were far more individualistic. They began with two people choosing each other before presenting their union before the church and the law. The new couple was expected to establish their own home apart from either family. To them, a household was defined by romantic companionship between one man and one woman, not by any broader communal ties. Victorian values reshaped even the roles within these marriages. Love and companionship were expected to be the foundation of Christian unions, with the husband cast as economic provider and the wife as homemaker. A respectable Christian woman was not expected to work outside the home. Her full time was to be devoted to domestic duties. This ideal stood in sharp contrast to the realities of native Yoruba marriages. As Christian Mann notes, after customary marriage, husbands and wives had clear-cut economic rights and duties to one another. Husbands provided wives with a place to live, gave them a small amount of capital with which to begin trading, and contributed to the support of their children. Wives, on the other hand, cooked and performed domestic labor for their husbands, but also traded or engaged in some other economic activity outside the home to help maintain themselves and their children. They had their own incomes, which were often larger than their husband's earnings. Economically, both spouses retained considerable independence and exercised exclusive control over their own affairs. In practice, the Christian model sought to enforce economic dependence and a rigid hierarchy within marriage, while the Yoruba system allowed women significant economic agency, often making them as financially influential as their husbands, if not more so. Among the Yoruba, polygyny was widespread, respected, and often essential for building extended households, economic networks, and social alliances. To the British colonialists, however, it was an affront to be stamped out. These frictions revealed something deeper. Colonial Lagos was not simply adopting British customs wholesale, but chiseling at them, reshaping and testing their limits. Christian marriages may have been enshrined in law and sanctified by the church, but native realities endured, bending the rigid forms of Victorian marriage to fit a society that still measured kinship and obligation in its own terms. By the turn of the 20th century, Lagos was a city transformed. Kinship, lineage, wealth, and military might had long determined who held sway in the larger Yoruba society. But annexation and colonization had shifted the ground. A new elite was rising, not from old royal lines or warrior houses, but from classrooms, pulpits, and government offices. These new elites formed a parallel middle to upper class, separate from older, more established families and social structures. While they pursued Western education to become doctors, lawyers, church ministers, school teachers, and civil servants, their more established counterparts in the old order rode on family links with foundations in large-scale agriculture, the war economy, slave trading, and general trading. Some families even combined all into one giant empire. The birth of the colonial economy, which had sufficient funding to sustain this new elite and the local economy they rode on, conferred much influence on them. while the native order was firmly planted on legacy. The new complementary elite's influence came from Western education and proximity to the colonial superstructure. This new complementary elite included returnee slaves from Sierra Leone and the Americas, Yoruba migrants from the interior, and non-Yoruba who had settled in Lagos. From a study on the matter, only about 5% of this new elite belonged to families that had lived in Lagos for more than 3 generations. The new elites were new money, and as all social classes are established, their entry into the colonial economy was carefully gate-kept. To access its full benefits, one had to embrace the twin pillars of Christianity and Western education. These institutions, largely established and run by missionaries, were more likely to admit those who professed the Christian faith. At this time, to profess Christianity was more than a matter of belief. It was a passport to status. It opened the doors of mission schools, colonial offices, and elite households, and it determined, to an increasing degree, how one was expected to marry. To seal this new structure in place, the colonial government introduced the Marriage Ordinance of 1884. The law prohibited individuals from marrying under both Yoruba customs and colonial law. A man who married under the ordinance was bound by Christian monogamy. He could not take a second wife, and if he died in state, his estate will be distributed according to colonial inheritance law. Violation meant fines, imprisonment, and more. But while the law restricted choice, it also created opportunity. For many among the educated elites, ordinance marriage became a path to upward mobility. It wasn't unheard of that a man will marry into a native Christian family of means and connections and would suddenly be handed career-lifting promotions or recommendations. Others used ordinance marriage as a signal of status already attained. One colonial servant, having received the promotion, promptly married under the ordinance, not because he needed it to climb further, but because the very act of doing so announced his new station. Ordinance weddings were often grand affairs, staged in churches with lavish receptions, hundreds in attendance, and reports in the newspapers. For many, these ceremonies were occasions to display wealth, sophistication, and prestige. J.P.L. Davis, a prominent figure in Lagos society, expressed his pleasure at the size of the crowd at his Western marriage, noting that it reflected his position in the social world. Thus, for many, the choice was largely symbolic. Ordinance marriage was the price of entry into elite society, the gateway to influence, and the stage upon which success was displayed. Customary marriage still thrived, but among the upwardly mobile, ordinance marriage carried the promise of legitimacy and prestige. It was into this world of uneasy compromises and shifting ideals that Dr. Oguntola Sapara lived and loved. And it was precisely here, at this intersection of native marriage and the ordinance marriage, that his story with Adele and later Ore Green would unfold. Only 8 Nigerians qualified as medical doctors in the 19th century, and Dr. Oguntola Sapara was the last of them. He obtained his medical license at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Edinburgh in 1885, joined the Colonial Medical Services in 1886, and by 1887 had already helped to dismantle a smallpox cult in Ekpe, which was standing in the way of total eradication of the disease in the city. This accomplishment earned him the Imperial Service Order Award from King George V. From then on, his career became a catalogue of public health milestones. In 1900, he launched a campaign against the filth and jungle of Ibutemeta, one of the earliest organized attempts to improve sanitation in Lagos. A year later, he oversaw the construction of the first public dispensary at Shaki, extending medical access deep into the Yoruba hinterland. By 1918, at a conference on tuberculosis in Lagos, Sapara co-authored a landmark paper with Dr. J.M. Dalziel, which exposed the danger of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and public ignorance. The recommendations eventually helped push sanitation reform beyond tuberculosis to the broader city environment. In 1924, as chairman of the Health Week Committee, he led the campaign that successfully contained the bubonic plague outbreak in Lagos. As of 1904, when our story begins, Sapara was already one of the top medical practitioners in Lagos, and he often treated certain private patients pro bono, possibly as a form of community service. It was during one of such consultations that he met his soon-to-be wife, Adele Coker, while treating her sister, Helen Willoughby, in Broad Street, Lagos. Both women were daughters of a renowned clergyman and music composer, Reverend Robert Arafumi Coker, known in his prime as the Mozart of Africa. In the late 1900s, he composed the seminal Yoruba hymn, Ogoni Fun Baba, which remains a staple of Christian gatherings to this day. It's not entirely clear why Sapara was drawn to Adele or vice versa, but one can make an educated guess. Adele was 28 when she met him, unmarried, a single parent, and living with her sister. The man who fathered her child was absent, and in a family where all her sisters had followed the prescribed Christian path by marrying in church and raising children respectably, Adele had taken another road. She was a free spirit, an outsider by choice, living lightly, unbothered by the rigidity of the world around her. During her deposition, her father would later bemoan her lamentable moral character, a phrase that conveyed his disapproval of her continued indiscretions. Sapara, by contrast, was 54. He had married at least once in the traditional way and had a child, but unlike most men of his standing, he had never settled into the stability of an established home. His brother, Christopher Sapara Williams, embodied the opposite path. He was a celebrated lawyer, activist, and politician who built his name on discipline and structure. Oguntola, meanwhile, remained unsettled. His work as a colonial doctor kept him on the move, and his life was defined more by service and transience than by permanence. Even Adele's father, when asked for his opinion of Sapara, remarked that he didn't seem like a marrying man. In different ways, both Adele and Sapara stood at the margins of society's expectations. She had slipped away from the strict moral structure of her family, he from the rigid world of his profession and peers. Their union felt like a meeting of temperaments, two kites drifting in the wind, untethered, yet moving in parallel, drawn together precisely because they lived outside the lines others had drawn for them. On December 29, 1904, slightly before 7 p.m., a group of 5 women cast long shadows on Bangboshe Street. Walking together under the fading gaze of the evening sun, they set out from a house opposite the municipal building, past the Wesley Church at Tinubu Square, and made their way down the street towards the police officers' quarters on Broad Street. To a casual observer, it might have looked like half a dozen women on an errand, or simply taking an evening stroll together. But we know better. It was a wedding procession. The women were engaged in the final act of the native wedding rites, called Igbeyawo, which literally means carrying the bride. The term refers to older Yoruba weddings, where the bride will be symbolically lifted onto the shoulders of kin and carried to her husband's family house. This ritual marked the conclusion of an elaborate sequence of rites and customs that defined marriage in Yoruba land. By the early 20th century, many of these traditions had begun to fade in Lagos, eclipsed by the rising dominance of colonial life. Yet, among the Yoruba elites, elements of the old ways endured, if only in symbolic form. The bride was no longer physically carried, but her family was still required to escort her to her husband's door. Among the women in that quiet procession was Adele Coker, walking alongside a handful of her kin, mostly from her father's side. The guiding hand behind it all, however, was Mrs. G.P. Johnson, who, after the death of Adele's mother decades earlier, had assumed the mantle of family matriarch. It was she who orchestrated the evening's rites, offering prayers for Adele at her Bangboshe Street residence. before sending the younger women out to escort her. We can put a pin on this single procession on Broad Street, but beneath it lay a story that had begun months before, in a different home, under different circumstances. After Sapara met Adele at her sister's house in July 1904, he soon found cause to visit more frequently, often under the pretext of treating her sister, Helen Willoughby. His visits continued until October. That same July, he approached Adele directly and declared his wish to marry her in the native fashion. She pressed him on why he could not marry her in church, as was expected. Sapara replied that he had sought to marry several ladies under English custom, but each attempt had failed. The explanation did little to settle her doubts, but their meetings deepened. Conversation gave way to closeness, and closeness to intimacy. By August, Adele was pregnant with Dr. Sapara's child. The pregnancy brought a new twist to the tale. Marriage, which had once led their conversations but had slipped into the background, now returned to the fore. Sapara reached out to Adele's sister, Helen Willoughby, in whose home she lived, and expressed his desire to marry her. Helen directed him to the family's elder and respected matriarch, Mrs. G.P. Johnson. Like most elders, Mrs. Johnson received the news of Adele's engagement with joy. Despite circumstances, after meeting with Sapara, she summoned Adele and urged her to give her consent, with the assurance that if she agreed and behaved, Dr. Sapara would in time marry her in church. Around October, Adele was struck by two devastating personal losses. She first suffered a miscarriage of the child she carried for Dr. Sapara, and soon after, her 2-year-old also passed away within the same month. It must have been a harrowing time, but from all indications, Dr. Sapara stood by her with steady support. By the close of October, however, preparations for the wedding were already in full swing. According to traditional rites, a groom was required to send gifts to the bride's family, which were then shared between her maternal and paternal lines as a sign of approved betrothal. These items usually included kola nuts, bitter kola, alligator pepper, and gin or whiskey. This practice, known as ano in English, token of spousage, was a necessary precursor to marriage. By mid-November, Sapara had taken Adele's ring measurement and informed her that he was preparing the ano: a Bible, a ring, cola, and some cash to cover the remaining items. He entrusted this to Mrs. Johnson, who in turn passed it to the family patriarch, Chief Isaac Coker, Adele's paternal uncle. His consent was both necessary and decisive in securing the marriage. Thus, the preceding months of love, loss, and promise all led to this night, the moment Adele's family took her to Dr. Sapara's door. When the group arrived at Dr. Sapara's house, they were received by some of the elder women of his household. Prayers were offered, gifts exchanged, and the party was sent on its way. The marriage was now sealed, but what unfolded in years ahead would test it in ways no ceremony could protect against. In the months that followed, Sapara handed her the wedding ring and insisted she take the name Madame Adele Sapara. He introduced her to his circle of friends and family, and for a time, the union seemed happy. By the turn of the new year, Adele was pregnant again, but the child was delivered stillborn in August 1905. The loss was devastating, and while this might have been the beginning of their woes as a couple, they both held on. In 1907, they finally welcomed a child, and with it came a fragile hope that steadiness might at last define their lives. But steadiness was never Sapara's gift. His temperament was restless, shaped by a career that kept him always on the move, and by a disposition that resisted permanence. Adele, by contrast, seemed to be bending towards groundedness, perhaps even stability, as though marriage and motherhood were drawing her into a firmer rhythm. Where she tried to anchor, he drifted. By 1911, the cracks between them had widened. Adele's sister, Helen Willoughby, would later remark that her sister was not living a good life. Whether she left the home or was sent away is unclear, but their estrangement by that year was certain. As their union dissolved, Sapara was already looking elsewhere. His attention had turned to a younger woman, Olaore Green, and with her came the spark of another marriage, one that will drag all these private struggles into the unforgiving arena of the colonial courts. At around 2:30 p.m. on Wednesday, August 23, 1911, the Chief Justice of the colony, Sir A. Willoughby Osborne, took his seat on the bench of the Supreme Court. The courtroom was packed, its air heavy with anticipation. At one table sat some of the sharpest legal minds of the colony. The Honorable Christopher Alexander Sapara Williams, Sapara's elder brother and the first Nigerian to be called to the English bar. He was joined by J.T.N. Cole and C.J. Forsyth. Together, they represented the defendant, Dr. Oguntola Sapara, and the woman he now sought to marry, Miss Sarah Olaore Green. Across from them, alone but unflinching, was Mr. J.E. Shingle, appearing on behalf of the plaintiff, Madam Adele Sapara, who had entered a formal caveat against the registrar's certificate under the Marriage Ordinance of 1881. To show the high-profile nature of the case, even the Attorney General of the Colony of Lagos, Honorable A.K. Pennington, was in attendance. At stake was Adele's claim that she was already the lawful wife of Dr. Sapara under native law and custom. If she was correct, Sapara could not proceed with a church wedding to Miss Green. If she were not, then the path would be clear for him to remarry in the English form. Adele's position was clear. She insisted that she was Sapara's lawful wife, married to him under Yoruba custom. She described how their no, which means token of spousage, had been sent and how the family matriarch, Mrs. G.P. Johnson, had blessed the match. She even recounted how she had been escorted to Sapara's residence in the symbolic procession that marked the end of a marriage rite. To her, it was a wedding in every sense of the word. Sapara's counsel denied the claim. He argued that the foundation of the matter was a pregnancy. According to them, after Adele had found herself in the family way by Dr. Sapara, the late Mrs. G.P. Johnson summoned him to confirm it. The arrangements that followed, the defense suggested, was little more than protection for a woman in trouble. The counsel argued that Mrs. Johnson had said, since the pregnancy had been acknowledged, Adele should go and live with the doctor, and that was all. One of the most striking claims in Adele's testimony was her recollection that Mrs. Johnson had told her that if she agreed and behaved, Sapara would eventually marry her according to English custom. Sapara flatly denied ever saying such a thing, and Mrs. Johnson herself was not alive to confirm or deny it. Other witnesses hinted she may indeed have spoken those words, but it was impossible to be sure, and so the case teetered on conflicting memories and contested truths. Soon enough, witnesses lined up on both sides. On Adele's behalf, her sister Helen Willoughby recounted the doctor's repeated visits and his clear expressions of intent. Nancy Davis, one of the women who escorted Adele to Sapara's house, spoke of the procession at Bangbushe Street and the escorting of the bride in accordance with custom. Even the editor of the Lagos Standard, Mr. G.A. Williams, testified that the marriage had been published in the newspapers without any denial from Sapara. As a matter of fact, he even requested extra copies for record keeping. Chiefs Odunsi Sarumi and Fajebi, native authorities in their own rights, explained that once their no was given, the uncle's consent secured, and the procession made, the essentials of marriage were satisfied. Sapara's defense marshaled its own force. Adele's father, Reverend Ari Coker, lamented that his daughter's behavior had long strayed from respectability. Although he agreed that the marriage was binding, since it had been approved by his older brother, who was the head of the family, he still lamented the fact that he was not allowed to register his consent, which in any case, he would not have given. Bishop Isaac Oluwole of the Anglican Church went further, declaring the affair illicit and void of any Christian sanction. Chiefs Eletu and Obanikoro added that the rites as described were incomplete. Without the full sequence of ceremonies, no Yoruba would recognize it as binding. The courtroom became a mirror of Lagos itself, half of it rooted in custom, the other half straining towards colonial sensibilities. Chiefs and elders spoke of kola nuts, uncles' blessings, and the solemnity of Theano, while clergymen and administrators spoke in the clipped certainty of statutes and church sanction. Each side told the same story, but twisted through the prism of its own values, each insisting on its own sense of truth. Yet here, history falls silent. The Lagos Standard of September 1911 reported the proceedings in detail, testimony after testimony, but the paper then broke off. The issues almost certainly continued, but no surviving copies have been found. No court minutes remain either. The trail goes cold at the very moment of judgment, leaving us suspended in uncertainty. What we do know, however, lies outside the courtroom. Dr. Sapara never married Sarah Olaore Green, the woman at the heart of Adele's accusation, nor is there any record that he and Adele ever reconciled. Their paths, once tangled in scandal, appear to have unraveled for good. By 1912, Sarah Olaore Green had vanished from Lagos life as quietly as she had lived through its scandal. The court case had unfolded around her, yet she had said nothing, not a word of testimony, no recorded statement in her own defense or in Sapara's, or at least none that we are aware of. She remained silent, a figure on whom so much hinged, and yet left no trace of her own voice in the public record. In London, she pursued further studies and earned a first-class degree in music and another in midwifery. By 1916, she achieved a milestone that history would remember. She became the first West African woman to qualify as a pharmacist. It was a remarkable accomplishment, positioning her among the pioneering African women of her generation. We have no record of her ever getting married or having children. Her legacy rested primarily on the career she built and the independence she carved out for herself. Maybe this was part of the attraction for Sapara. Unlike Adele, Olaore Green represented something that matched the emerging colonial elites: education, refinement, and the professional credentials that could stand shoulder to shoulder with his own. A church wedding with her would not only have offered companionship, but also consolidated his position in the new Lagos society that was fast taking shape. A society defined as much by diplomas and professions as by family name. But the case ruined that prospect. Adele's lawsuit, with its messy airing of private affairs, made a church wedding to Olaore Green impossible. Respectability was the currency of the new elite, and the scandal drained it quickly. All we are left with is the silence of Olaore Green in 1911 and the brilliance of her career in the years that follow. She fades from the courtroom drama, only to reappear as a figure of accomplishment abroad. Her Lagos scandal buried beneath the weight of her London triumphs. She returned to Lagos in 1917 and worked as a midwife in a private hospital. She later went on to set up her private practice at 17 Campbell Street in the 1920s. There, she operated as a nurse and pharmacist and was fondly known as Nurse Green. After London, Sarah Green largely disappeared from public record. We know of her professional success, but little of her private life. No speeches, controversies, or further appearances in the papers or records. She became in many ways the antithesis of Adele. Discreet, disciplined, and ambitious. If Adele was a flame that flared brightly in public view, Sarah was the steady lamp that burned quietly, illuminating the path she chose for herself. In the end, The wedding never happened, and in its absence, it left behind more questions than answers. History remembers Sapara for his medical practice, his battle with the smallpox cult, and his pioneering work in public health. It remembers Olaore Green as West Africa's first female pharmacist, a woman who broke barriers in a profession that barely admitted women in England, let alone in colonial Africa. Together, they left behind a fragment of a story, one that will have been lost but for Adele's determination to bring it into light. Now here's the kicker. If Adele had not taken Sapara to court, we may never have known that behind his accomplishments, there was a failed marriage and scandal. That Sarah Green, so dignified and restrained, had been entangled in the mess of a man already bound to another. We may never have found that Sapara, who was highly regarded in the colony, tried to stretch the native system to its limits by marrying one woman, hiding her from the glare of colonial respectability, while reaching for another who could anchor him within the elite world. It also showed us how the characters' lives intersected with the different phases of colonialism. Adele used the colonial court to defend her interests when native custom alone might have left her without recourse. Sapara tried to bend both systems, marrying one woman under native custom and seeking another under colonial law, a reflection of the duality of his age. Sarah Green, ambitious and well-educated, embodied the promise of social status that colonial structures extended to a select few. A doctor and a pioneering pharmacist could have been remembered as a power couple of their age, a union of intellect in medicine and public service. Instead, they were remembered separately, their stories diverging like entwined threads, pulled apart by circumstance and law. And yet, that divergence is its own revelation, because it reminds us that history is not simply a roll call of accomplishments, nor a neat list of firsts. It also includes the stories of ordinary lives colliding, of private conflicts spilling into public records, of love, jealousy, ambition, and disappointment. We flatten our historical figures into monuments, forgetting that they too wrestled with the mess of human entanglements. They too were as ordinary and as complicated as the Nigerians we know today. This story shows us a window into how colonialism reordered private life, redefined marriage, and reshaped ambition. It shows us who got to count as respectable, who got cast aside, and why. It was about one man trying to straddle two worlds, one woman pushing back with the tools of empire, and another carving a legacy by turning away from scandal altogether. And so, as the curtain falls, the lesson is not about a marriage that failed to materialize, but about a society in transition where law and custom, faith and ambition, private desire and public order clashed in its transition to modernity. The wedding never happened, but in its absence, it revealed the world that colonial Lagos was becoming. Thank you for listening to this episode of Ordinary Nigerians. If you enjoyed it, kindly give us a like on whatever platform you're listening on and follow us on social media at Nige History Pod. That's NIG History POD. This episode was written, directed and produced by Samuel Smish Ishola. Scoring, audio production and voiceover by Shid Cordis Brian, with administrative and research support from Eniola Busari and Sopul Shid. Ordinary Nigerians is executive produced by Outhouse Productions, SG24 Productions, and the very good people at Archiving under the first cohort of the Archiving Fellowship.